Hello and welcome to the next episode of Nostalgic Pixel. I'm Brian. In this episode, this very special episode, we're going to be looking at hardware, specifically my gaming setup. That's right, we're going to look at what consoles I've hooked up to the TV as well as how I have them hooked up. My old consoles, I use an upscaler, the xRGB-mini Framemeister, which I've had for a few years. While I know it may not be the best, it is very good and I've really enjoyed it. Also, my setup runs the gamut from PlayStation 4 all the way down to the NES. So we're going to cover my history of hooking up consoles to the TV, as well as explaining how I got here today and what all this stuff means. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as we dig into my gaming setup. It all started with my first console, the Nintendo Entertainment System. It came with Rob the Robot, Light Gun, Gyromite, and Duck Hunt. I also got Mike Tyson's Punch-Out along with it for Christmas that year. This introduced me to different video types, as the console had RF and composite. I was lucky enough to have the TV in my room that I got to play this on that also had composite. So I got to early on experiment with different video types. And as I noticed, the composite on the NES made a huge difference in the picture quality when playing these old games. And after that, I was always looking at the backs of TVs to see what kind of connections they were, and I was always very much interested in paying attention to the new cables. Growing up, I was very lucky to have access to TVs that had these different types of video connections like S-Video and composite, as my dad had a trade show he'd have to go to every year. And in the booth, they had to have TVs to show the videos of the rides. And while that was only for 1 week out of the year, the rest of the year, that TV, or at least one of them, was in my room. Okay, so let's look at some analog video connections that we're going to be talking about. The first one is RF, and RF is trash. However, it is the most available, and that you're going to find it on everything and anything. However, if it is your only option, it should be your last and only option. The next step up is composite. As I pointed out, my first experience with composite was with my original console, the NES. I could see the huge difference in it because there would be a lot less noise because the signal on RF is all the audio and the video on one cable, and while component breaks that out for the audio for its own cables, and in this you're going to see it's broken up into left and right channels, and the video in its own cable. So this makes for a huge improvement with a lot less noise, but still not ideal, as there's a lot of room for improvement and still plenty of color bleeding going on in composite. So the next step up is S-Video. S-Video is a huge step up, and if it's as high as you can go on something, then it's a really good place to be, because S-Video is nice in that it breaks up the signal at least a little bit to get the components separated with the sync and the color going through. The next one up after that I was first run across was in the late 90s on DVD players. It's Component. Component is great. At first glance, you see the colors of the cables, you see red, green, and blue, and you're thinking, okay, great, this is it. And while it is a form of RGB, the green cable is actually sending the sync signal along using the red and blue to figure out what the green should be by process of elimination. And then over on the end here, this is for me is the newest one to learn about, although it is not the newest type of cable, is SCART. SCART to me originally looked like an old computer cable for my Mac, like a SCSI cable. No, SCART is not surprising if you've never heard of it, because it was only available in Europe and not in the US. So growing up, I didn't have access to this type of cable. The thinking behind the cable in Europe was unlike the TVs that we have in America, where they had all the different kind of plugs out the back. They thought they'd make it simpler. Instead of having different types of plugs for all the things, you just make one plug that has all the different types of video cables and connections. So the SCART actually has composite, S-Video, RGB, audio, and all that stuff into this one cable. That's why there's so many pins. But also, for my use, is that I want the RGB signal out of here, which is the red, green, and blue video, as well as the sync, all broken up into their separate parts to create cleanest picture that I can get out of these analog systems. So one thing to be noted is that SCART looks exactly like JP21 in Japan. They are identical, and the difference is the pin layout. So the important thing is whichever one you get, you want to make sure you're sticking with that system, either JP21 or SCART. I went with SCART because it's used across an entire continent, and there'd be better chances of getting cables and splitters, which we'll get to later. But as you can see, they are identical in their appearance, and it is very important that you stick with one type and make sure not to get any other type of cable mixed in, or you could basically break your equipment, which would be really bad. My last TV was this 27-inch CRT from Sony. It was great. It has all the connections that I ever wanted at the time. It had Composite, which was the big deal. It had S-Video, which was great, and had Composite and plenty others. But I was really very interested in the Composite, and it's a good TV. For me, I played all my old systems on here up to a point where I decided, hey, you know, I would like to be able to play these old consoles on my big HDTV. And when I first tried to do it, I was very disappointed in the results. The picture didn't look anything like I remembered growing up as a kid. It looked like a really bad compressed JPEG. And also, the lag made it really frustrating because I was playing some of my old favorite games like Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, and you can't play Mike Tyson's Punch-Out with lag. You're going to lose. It's all about timing, and the games back then were designed not to have lag because lag was something that was later introduced with HDTVs. So lag really wasn't designed in the games, and it becomes a real problem. But also, like I mentioned, is the picture quality. It was just really disappointing. I just went right back to playing them on my old CRT for a long time. So when I first started hearing about the term upscaling, it was with DVD players, and then I also noticed that some high-end AV receivers included upscaling. I began to do research online, and it seemed like when I was looking at it, I was looking at the history of all these different upscalers and not just the only thing that was the current thing on the market. It was a little bit confusing. It was interesting, and along the way, I was learning about SCART and RGB because, as I mentioned before, it never happened in America. It was something that was available in Europe. So this was something new to me, and you know, at my time, I thought that for analog video cables, Composite was the end of it. It was the top. But one thing I found out was clear. At the time, the Framemeister was the king of upscalers. While it did ask for a very hefty price tag, I knew I had a lot of game systems growing up that I wanted to use with it. And I knew they had S-Video and had Composite for the D terminal in the back that I was able to understand, and had all the connections. I was really excited at the time it had S-Video, but I wasn't ready to pull the trigger, and the pictures on the internet weren't just, you know, it was just hard to kind of really see the benefit, although I did notice that most people weren't talking about those connections. They were talking about the RGB port on it, and that was what I had to learn about. Again, doing research, it was almost like digging through every scaler, you know, so articles that were like 5 or 6 years old were talking about something else versus ones that were more recent. So it's still just always trying to understand this, and if any of the old stuff were still worth it or easy to find. But no, everything kept pointing back to the Framemeister. The RGB connection was the thing that broke the whole thing open for me. It just like cracked it wide open and made it like, wow, okay, now I see the true benefit of these scalers. Is, of course, I knew growing up the better video signal is, you know, the clearer your picture is with less bleeding and everything. But also this is hugely important when you're upscaling. It wasn't until I saw the episode of My Life in Gaming where they first talked about the Framemeister and showed off the results of the RGB input, and I could see them, besides looking at a screenshot, to really appreciate, is when I was ready to pull the trigger. And when I did right away after seeing that video, after I'd learned so much about the Framemeister, it really clicked once I saw RGB in action. Here we have an off-screen video comparison of my NES. On the left is my NES hooked directly through Composite to my HDTV, and on the right is my NES connecting to my xRGB-mini Framemeister via RGB to my HDTV. This is about as drastic of a change as you can get. Here we have my NES again, hooked up through Composite, S-Video, and RGB SCART. Now all these are hooked up through the Framemeister. You can definitely see the difference between composite to S-Video. The S-Video to RGB SCART is less noticeable. As you can see here, S-Video is a huge improvement over just standard composite. However, this setup is not exactly fair in that the only way I had S-Video out of the Nintendo is because I have it modified for RGB SCART, and that included the S-Video. The next comparison is of my original Super Nintendo that has no modifications. This is the video signal for composite, S-Video, and RGB SCART. As you can see, there is a huge leap still from composite to S-Video, as the picture is sharper and the colors have less bleeding. Now, there is a difference between S-Video and RGB SCART. It is not as clear as the leap from composite to S-Video, but it definitely is there. Let's take a closer look at some of this. Here's a close-up comparing composite, S-Video, and RGB SCART. Again, you can see the big difference between composite and S-Video, as there is a huge jump in image quality and clarity. And I can see the S-Video to RGB SCART difference. I can tell the difference between RGB and S-Video, while again it is not as clear of a difference between composite and S-Video. It is there, and that the RGB has kind of a fuller color palette in its clarity, and then S-Video, as you can see, kind of still has a lot of its same colors, brightness and stuff, as the composite signal. Also, the RGB SCART is just that little bit more sharper in image. Here are all the consoles that I have connected to my video game setup and the types of video signals that I'm using from them. These are the ones that are using HDMI. These are the ones that I'm drawing RGB signals using SCART. And here are the ones that I'm using a component signal from. And here's the N64, the only console that I'm using S-Video on, because this system does require it to be modified for RGB, and well, I just haven't cared enough to do it. So here's my gaming setup. Let's take a closer look. First up, we have my Nintendo Switch. My Nintendo Switch is the newest console to the collection. It's a lot of fun. I enjoy playing it in the portable mode with the Pro controller when it's not hooked up to the TV. It is great to see all these old classics becoming released on the Switch, because this really is kind of a hybrid console of being a portable and hooked up to the TV like it is. I'm happy Nintendo has found some success with this, as I'm excited to see the games they have coming out down the pipe. I've really enjoyed some of the few games that I have been playing on my Switch, and I can't wait to see what's next. In the first drawer we have at the top is my PlayStation 4. My PlayStation 4 has been a really fun console to have. I've enjoyed it. I've had it since it first came out. It's been a lot of fun. There's one of the things I like is some of these re-releases of some of these classic games that I like to see come out to the modern consoles. And this is kind of my go-to one. Right below it, we have the PlayStation 3. Well, this is my second PlayStation 3. The first one I had was the original 60 gig. It stopped working years ago, and I got this one. It's been great. I've really enjoyed it. I have a huge digital library, and I love playing some of these re-released classic games that are on there. And I also use this to play my PlayStation 1 games, as it has a great ability to do so, as well as I can, I've downloaded some of the rare PlayStation 1 games that I haven't had a chance to get a hold of physically. But it's really great because I have a wireless controller and I don't have to worry about buying memory cards to play the system. Although I am looking into possibly getting an RGB cable for my PlayStation 1. But for the most part, this is how I play them when I'm not playing them on my Vita. Next up is my PlayStation 2. My PlayStation 2 has been a great console. This is my original one, and it still works today. I got it with my roommate at the time. I have had to get it repaired by Sony years ago, but it has been a true champion and it has been worked, and it's great. There are still many great games on the PlayStation 2 that have not yet had an HD re-release. Next to that, we have my Wii U, which has been a great console. There are plenty of interesting games on there. While it has never been my go-to console, it has been my Nintendo console for sure. And also, it comes in handy, and that it also is, for me, my Wii that I like to play. I transferred all my games from my original Wii over to this one, so they're now all here. Well, I kind of wish I didn't do that. I'm still happy that they're there, and it's very convenient because here's one Wii console that is the Wii U and the Wii all in one. I already have enough consoles hooked up that it's nice to be able to consolidate where I can. It's good to see some of these gems on this console get re-released on the Switch, and I hope that trend continues because I'd hate to see some of these really amazing games get locked onto this console. Next drawer is my Pelican AV component switcher. This I got back in the day when I had my PlayStation 2 and my GameCube and my Xbox, and they all used component, or at least two of them did at the time. And I wanted to have a switcher because I had a DVD player, I had my Xbox, and my PlayStation 2, and they all used component, and there was only one component input. Not only did component, it does all kinds. It does Ethernet, it has optical audio. It's a really big switcher that's come in handy, and I still have it and use it today. Underneath that is my AV receiver. Well, this one is pretty good. It's definitely not the best one, but one thing I was excited about is that it was 7.2 audio, and it had the HDMI connections were 4K pass-through, so I knew I had a little bit of future-proofing with that. And the next drawer over, we have my PlayStation TV, that little tiny micro console from Sony that they pretty much didn't talk very much about, and kind of was here, came and went before it even had a chance. While this console does have its problems, it's exciting that it can play Vita games, although unless you get it whitelisted, which is something I would like to do, not all Vita games do play, especially even for some reason PSP games. I have no idea why they don't play because there's nothing missing or lacking on this thing. I still enjoy playing my Vita, and I'm very happy with it, and this was a nice little companion to be able to play some of those games on the TV. Next to that is my Xbox 360. While this is my third Xbox 360, I'm fully expecting this one to red ring as well, as it is a much older model. I plan to keep my eyes open to picking up a newer model with its more reliable. Although this is a fun console, it has basically been, for me, exclusives mostly on this console. The backwards compatibility on this for the original Xbox games is also something that I enjoy using. Underneath that is my N64. This is my original N64. It's a lot of fun. It's the first full party console, and then it came with 4 ports in the front, which was a nice change. I remember playing lots of Mario Kart and GoldenEye on this. There are a few other games that are on here that are worth revisiting. It's kind of fun to have, but it's just not played as much as the other consoles, for sure. Next to that is the upscaler xRGB-mini Framemeister. We've talked a little bit about this, and as you've been seeing, footage is all captured running through here for my old retro consoles. And next to that is my GameCube. Yep, my original GameCube. I love this system. It is so much fun. I even have the component cables for it, which makes it great. Part of the reason I got those component cables was not just to play GameCube games, because if you want to play GameCube games, I would recommend, and you want to use component, and if you don't have it set up this way, or you don't buy it like a now is becoming available as plug-and-play HDMI adapters for it, if you just want to play GameCube games, the simplest way is to play a Wii. If you have a Wii that has GameCube compatibility, it is easy, cheap to get those component cables and a simple way to play. Now, the reason I didn't go that route is because I wanted to take advantage and use the Game Boy player that is connected below it. Yes, so the reason I have the GameCube set up is not just because I wanted to play GameCube games on the original GameCube, is because I also wanted to play Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games on the TV. I bought this when it all came out, and I have the Game Boy Player disc. However, these days it is not something that I used to play anymore with the Game Boy Player, as I found another option that I prefer, as it is more accurate and it's just better image quality. You know, I go down the rabbit hole so far to have component cables for my GameCube. The last thing I want is kind of a fuzzy picture when it comes to playing my Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. So I use this combination of the Code Junkies Action Replay and SD card adapter to load up the Game Boy interface. This is an open source software. It's great. It basically runs at a correct clock speed, and aspect ratio and everything's really good, and the picture is super sharp. It has been really fun playing Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games on my TV. Growing up, I didn't have a Game Boy or a Game Boy Color. I jumped in on the Game Boy Advance, and then I started going back into their back catalog of Game Boy Color and Game Boy games. So when this first option came out, I was thrilled, because even though I had a Game Boy Advance, this was so much clearer to see some of these games on a backlit television. There's one more thing that I use when I decide to play the Game Boy games on the GameCube, and while there is expensive third-party controllers out there, the problem I have with the GameCube controller playing these old Game Boy games is the D-pad is super tiny on the GameCube. So I got one of these RAFnet adapters. So I have GameCube to Super Nintendo adapter. For me, playing these Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games feels perfect playing on a Super Nintendo controller. Or in my case, actually, it's a Super Famicom controller. And next to those, we have my Genesis. Yep, this is my original Genesis, Model 1. I got it at Highland Park Electronics right when they were closing, so I got to use a gift card to use before they closed, and I was lucky enough to get this. This was my second console right after my Nintendo a few years later. It was great. I already got to see it over a friend's house. He had it. It was really cool. It came with Altered Beast, and I also bought Mickey Mouse's Castle of Illusion, which is one of my favorite games on the system. I also have the original Model 1 Sega CD. Sadly, it's broken, so I'm hoping to get it fixed, but that's why there's so much room in here, because with all this set up, you can end up with a tower of power, and it can take up a lot of headroom. I also got the Power Base converter for this to play Master System games. Well, I only knew one person growing up that had Master System games, my cousin. It was fun to play those. I always liked the idea that this was be able to play a whole nother console that I just really didn't have a whole lot of exposure to, right there just with this adapter. The Genesis was definitely not short on add-ons and adapters. I also have the 32X adapter to play 32X games. Can't say I have a whole lot of them, but it is nice to be able to play those subset of games. Next to my original Genesis is my AV Famicom, which I picked up with the NES RGB mod already pre-installed. I decided to get this because I wanted a Nintendo with an RGB mod, and I also wanted to have access to a little bit larger library than just the NES. By having a Famicom, I knew that I could play NES games with a simple adapter, and I also would be able to get the Nintendo Famicom Disk System, which I have connected to it right below it, which is great and just opens up the library to play all the NES games. And I thought it would be fun if I was going to buy something and I wanted, to have a little bit of familiar and new. So I decided to get this model, and it was the last late model for the NES in Japan. Although it can get a little ridiculous when you try to plug an NES game into it, because the size of the cart is so much bigger. It is almost its own tower of power when you have the Famicom Disk System added underneath it. Just easy to add one more thing there with a Game Genie and you got it. Yeah, the Famicom Disk System has been a lot of fun. It's interesting to play these old games that you have saves when they had passwords growing up, because I can save to the floppy disk, and it's just kind of neat to save to early 80s floppy disk from Japan. Next up, we have my Sega CDX. This is a all-in-one Sega Genesis and Sega CD. It was a little compact portable unit that came out. At the time, I already had a Model 1 that was working. I didn't see a really need for it as it was very expensive, and I also had a portable CD player, which this is actually a portable CD player if you want it to be, but it's not a portable Genesis or Sega CD. It does work with the 32X, however, as I really wanted to play Night Trap 32X. This is currently my system I use to play Sega CD games until I get my Model 1 fixed or get another Model 1. Next to that is my gscartsw. It is my SCART switcher. It is amazing. It's got 8 inputs and 2 out. I really like it. It comes in very handy, and I haven't quite filled it up, although I know if I tried I could easily do it, and then I'd have to see about getting another one. This is kind of an expensive piece. In fact, no, it is an expensive piece of equipment to the setup. It has become very, very useful, and I love that it can split the signal out in 2 different directions. So one signal goes to the xRGB-mini Framemeister that gets routed over to the HDTV, and the other one goes to my other gaming monitor, which we'll talk about soon. This model is currently not available, but Super G is selling the G-SCART Lite, which has some improvements on the board with sync. One of the major differences is the video. It still keeps the 2 outs, but they're both using the standard SCART connections, while this one is using something a little bit different. I have really enjoyed having this switcher, as I have had switchers for other video game consoles in the past. I have had experience by having switchers, and I knew that now that I've switched almost all my old consoles over to SCART, that having a switcher would be very useful, less wear and tear on all the cables, unplugging them and plugging them back in. This has been a really great addition to my gaming setup. And under that is my Super Nintendo. This is my first console that I bought with my own money. It is a great console. I still use it today. It's amazing that it works. Recently went through the process of retro-brighting it to bring it back to its original color and protect it from going brittle and falling apart. The only problem is because it is one of the earlier models of the Super Nintendo, I'm fairly certain that it is the 2-chip model and that it outputs like a slightly softer RGB signal, which for the most part I'm okay with, because this is the original Super Nintendo that I've been playing with since 1991, as I got it very soon after it was released in the US. I'm thrilled that it's still around and I love it. I do have plans though, when I did recently pick up a Super Nintendo Mini, the second revision model of the Super Nintendo, that I know has a 1-chip in it, but the thing is I have to RGB mod it, which I'm looking forward to doing. That is like a fun project in the future, and give this one a nice, much needed break. Super Nintendo has been an amazing console. It's one of my favorite consoles growing up. And next to the Super Nintendo is another 16-bit legend, the PC Engine Duo R, or better known in America, the TurboGrafx 16. Although this is the Japanese version, the PC Engine, it is also the Duo, which I do have a Turbo Duo, but this one is special because it's not only region modded for the Japanese and American HuCard games, the region free on the discs already out of the gate, but this model also has an RGB mod. Growing up, I only knew one person that had a TurboGrafx 16, but I knew no one that had a CD system. This original CD system came out around the same time as the Sega CD, and while I did get a Sega CD, I probably could have gone either way, but I was really happy that I went for the Sega CD. I always think about that, what if I had picked a Turbo Duo instead of a Sega CD? What would my collection and experience be like? Growing up, going over to my friend's house to play the TurboGrafx 16, I have many fond memories for this system. There are many great games that are just stayed exclusive to this console, and also what I have learned is that the CD-ROM system games are the real crown jewel, and there's so many of them that are just amazing on the system to play. I picked this system up because I had one game that I really wanted to play ever since I first heard about it coming out originally in the early 90s, and that is Castlevania Rondo of Blood. It is one of my favorite games and one of my favorite Castlevania games. There are many other great CD-ROM games for this system, but sadly the system is probably a big challenge to collect for. Many of the games are very expensive these days. Next up is my original Xbox. Sadly, this console is broken and I can't play anything on it. I do need to find a replacement, as there doesn't seem to any way I can get this fixed, but it's just much easier to just go get another one. However, I haven't yet done that, so for the meantime, I've been playing on my Xbox 360 the original Xbox games that are backwards compatible for now. Then below that is my Sega Saturn. This is a special Sega Saturn that a friend of mine gave me. He also gave me the Action Replay cartridge that I can use on the back for the extra RAM expansion that's needed, game saves, and also allows me to play Sega Saturn games from other regions. The Sega Saturn is an amazing console. While I didn't necessarily have one at the time it came out, my first console in that generation was the N64, and then very shortly after that was the PlayStation. But the Sega Saturn, it was a really cool system. I was one of those people that had a Sega CD, saw the 32X come and go, and then the Saturn was out and it was more expensive, and at the time I wasn't allowed to get video games, so it wasn't until I was in college again that I was able to get it, and the Saturn was already off the market. But I picked it up while I was in college after it had gone away, and picked up a few games for it. I really wish I had picked up more games for it, as I keep discovering more and more amazing games, and many of them that only just came out in Japan. This system had a lot of great nearly arcade perfect translations. Next up is Sega's last entry into the console market, the Dreamcast. This was a little bit bittersweet, because at the time, for me, I was already kind of disappointed with how the Sega Saturn went, and before that I was disappointed with the 32X. So when the Dreamcast came out, I already had an N64, I already had a PlayStation, and everyone knew that the PlayStation 2 was just around the corner. I did have a roommate that picked this one up before they went away, and we had a lot of fun playing it. It's a really charming system, and for this, it does have SCART. This console has another type of video connection that I'm sort of using, is VGA out. So what I did is I picked up this VGA adapter, the Toro. This is a special VGA adapter because while I am upscaling everything through the xRGB-mini Framemeister, it doesn't have a VGA connection, but this console does. So what I have here is a special artisan VGA adapter by Baharo Brothers that I imported, which is great. It not only takes the VGA signal and outputs it to either, if you want to use the VGA cable or connection, it's there, but it also pipes all that connection through the SCART connection, which is great. So it actually outputs, if the game does 480p through VGA, it'll actually properly do the 480p through the SCART. And for those few games that you can't force, VGA mode into, you still have the SCART connection, so you can play those games using the SCART connection. It's been really great. It was kind of a pricey adapter, but it's worth it because the quality is there, and the compatibility and the usability. They make a lot of different devices. This one worked out best for me because I was using the Framemeister as my upscaler, and it's great. I really enjoy it. Well, there you have it. That's a look at my setup. This all really got kicked off with the xRGB-mini Framemeister. After getting that and learning all about RGB, it kind of came full circle and went back around to CRTs with this PVM. It's been great. I first saw one earlier that year over at my friend's house, and once I got the gscart switcher, it was great in that it had two outputs, so it really made that much easier to tap into the RGB signal and hook it up to this PVM here. It's been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. I recently picked up an 8-inch PVM. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do with it yet. I have some ideas, maybe make a gaming chair. Right now it's a lot of fun. I have it daisy chained to the other 20-inch here that I have. I'm really enjoying it. These old CRTs look great, and they've been harder lately to get a hold of. That's just the way things are these days with this stuff. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoy it. When I'm by myself just hanging out, I will mostly play in front of the CRT, but when I have friends over, I'm definitely playing on the big screen. Also, by having this PVM, the CRT in my setup, I can play light gun games. Last year I played Police Knots on the Sega Saturn and had a lot of fun using the light gun. There is one more thing to look at in my gaming setup, and that is VR. Nope, not this VR. We're going to be looking at my PlayStation VR. It's just a whole different experience in some cases. I really enjoy some of the games that have come out for it, and I do like that it has been continued to get support. That was part of my interest in buying it in the first place. I didn't get it right away, but I bought it about a year after it came out. I was really just wanting to see that continued effort in supporting VR on the PlayStation, and I'm really happy to see more games continue to come out on the PlayStation VR, and that it is becoming, for VR, pretty successful, which I'm happy to see because the experiences are unique to their own. And I do enjoy even playing like old games, like Rez is amazing in VR. I love that game. It's originally, on Dreamcast in Japan. I first played it on the PlayStation 2. It's an amazing game, and it's so cool that I can take that kind of experience and play it and enjoy it in VR. So what's next for my gaming setup? Well, perhaps maybe another HDTV to replace the one I have now. Maybe 4K, we'll see. It seems like all the TVs these days are 4K. So that's something I'm interested in, and I know adding 4K to the setup will really throw a big wrench into things, but I'm kind of looking into that. But also, I have my last 27-inch CRT that I have. It's a really great TV. While it's not as sharp as the PVM, it is amazing for a 27-inch. I've thought about, getting a SCART to component adapter, since this does have component inputs, but also HD Retrovision has come out with a number of different cables for a lot of my consoles that I have. So I'm probably going to be looking into getting some of their cables, which I'm excited to try out. And as I mentioned, I'm using the xRGB-mini Framemeister, and at the time I got it, it was the best, and in some cases it still is the best, but I do know that the OSSC is out there, and it is a moving target. In some cases it does outperform the Framemeister, but otherwise it's a little bit more hands-on. I'm really happy with my Framemeister, but I am keeping a close eye on the OSSC to see where that goes. It continues to evolve and improve and change. Well, there you have it. That's a look at my gaming setup. I hope you guys have enjoyed this deep dive into how I have all these consoles hooked up and the journey that I have taken so far going down this deep rabbit hole for RGB. Well, I just want to let you guys also know that while this is my setup today, it is constantly evolving and changing. What works out for me, I am not advocating to work out for everybody. As you see, I have many different consoles hooked up for all different generations. So while you guys might not also be interested in playing all these different varieties of consoles, and heck, you might even like more, I'm always interested in talking about this stuff. If you want to leave a comment down below, I'll be happy to discuss this stuff further, as like I mentioned, my setup is constantly changing and evolving. I've got some ideas of where I want to go with this in the future, but I'm really happy with where it is today. Well, again, guys, thanks for watching and getting all the way this far in the episode. Please feel free to like and subscribe and share with your friends. I also like playing games on my PlayStation 4 in VR. It's a lot of fun.